It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to the Faculty of Education's Transformative Education Speaker Series at the University of British Columbia. The Transformative Education Speaker Series is organized primarily by SOGI UBC, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Inclusive Education. SOGI UBC is funded by the Jane Rule Initiative at UBC, established by Dr. Robert Quartermain. SOGI UBC aims to provide leadership toward the design of intersectionally inclusive education in the area of human rights and minority gender and sexuality. SOGI UBC is particularly focused on the design of SOGI inclusive education for teacher candidates in the Faculty of Education, who will, in turn, educate students in the K-12 system. The program aims to advance the leading edge of gender and sexuality education by supporting teacher education and K-12 schools to engage intersectionally with sexual and gender minority experience, history, community knowledge, and cultural production. In doing so, we aim to explicitly infuse anti-racist and decolonizing approaches to SOGI education. The global intensification of hate-based right-wing aggression, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism reminds us just how crucial is transformative education. A renewed fascism and populism have infected many institutions and communities across the world. We've all watched the unfolding spectacle of the contrasting events at the US Capitol, where a violent, primarily white mob invaded the Capitol building, and by Friday, only 80 arrests had been made. This outcome in stark comparison to the politically astute protests by Black Lives Matter in June following the police murder of George Floyd, which resulted in the day following in 289 arrests, with a total of approximately 14,000 arrests in June. For those folks who think it's different here in Canada, less than 3 months ago, the RCMP stood by while Micmac fisheries were attacked by a white mob and later burned to the ground. The Transformative Education Public Speaker Series aims to engage with cutting-edge and leading scholars, activists, and artists working at the nexus of gender and sexuality, anti-racism, and Indigenous resurgence. In addition to the public lecture, each invited speaker meets with a small group of students in our teacher education program to consider the immediate applications of their work to teacher practice. To introduce today's speaker, Dr. Harper Keenan, the Robert Quartermain Professor of Gender and Sexuality Research in Education.
Thank you, Dr. Bryson. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the third lecture in our Transformative Education Speaker Series. Please note that the next event in the series will be a lecture by Chris Vargas, who is a professor at Western Washington University and is the founder of the Museum of Transgender History and Art, and that will be on February 8th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Registration information is going to be posted in the chat. In echoing Dr. Bryson's comments, I can't continue without recognizing that we're hosting this event today amid extraordinary global challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to last week's violent white nationalist coup in my own birthplace of Washington, D.C. I'm sure that many of us are carrying the profoundly heavy weight of these and other events. At the same time, I'm grateful to be gathered virtually with you all today to learn from the scholarship of Dr. Ed Brockenbrough, as I believe his urgent work invites us to consider how we might live together differently in a more just world. I thank each of you in attendance for doing whatever you needed to do to be able to be here today, and for whoever may be providing labor that allows you to be here, from our IT staff to childcare providers. A sincere thanks to the SOGI UBC program coordinator, Dr. Lori McIntosh, who managed the logistical coordination for this event, to our Dean Bly Frank, our Associate Dean Mary Bryson, and the staff in the Dean's office, Dr. Jan Hare and the staff of the Office of Indigenous Education, Dr. Marianne McTavish and the staff in the Teacher Education Office, for all of their enthusiastic support and sponsorship of this speaker series, as well as to Steve Mulligan, our SOGI educator, our teaching assistant, Danielle Gallardo Zamora, our web developer, Pitika McMahon, and our ASL interpreter, Kirsten Hageman, who's working to ensure greater access for our participants today. Just as a brief note, there will be no questions from the audience at the end. Instead, UBC doctoral student LJ Slovin will engage in a brief dialogue with Dr. Brockenbrough, who I will introduce now. Dr. Ed Brockenbrough is an associate professor and the inaugural Calvin Bland Faculty Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on diversity and social justice issues in education to future K-12 educators. His research focuses on negotiations of identity, pedagogy, and power in urban educational spaces, particularly through the lenses of Black masculinity studies and queer of color critique. His most recent study, co-led by Dr. Mitchell Wharton and funded by the University of Rochester's Center for AIDS Research, examined young Black queer men's pedagogical engagements with sexually explicit internet sites and smartphone hookup apps. He is currently launching a new study with his Calvin Bland Faculty Fellow peers on diversion programs for young Black men in Philadelphia at risk of incarceration. He is the author of Black Men Teaching in Urban Schools, Reassessing Masculinity, published by Routledge in 2018, and he's preparing a new book on Black queer pedagogies for publication in 2021. It's my great honor to welcome Dr. Ed Brockenbrough.
And Dr. Keenan, before you disappear, just remind me again, how long do we go until?
Until about 4:50, and then we'll start the dialogue with LJ.
Okay, thank you. I have to remind myself these things because I can be a long-winded academic. Just talk forever and forever. So I'll make sure I close on time, even if it means I have to shorten some of what I've prepared. So thank you everyone for attending today's talk. I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Keenan and to SOGI UBC for inviting me here. Today I'll be sharing snippets of a book project I hope to finish this summer, a solo authored collection of my unpublished and newly penned works on Black queer pedagogies. My talk today will focus specifically on considerations of queer youth sexual agency that I plan to include in the book. The title of my talk draws upon an old and enduring colloquialism that disparages anal sex. Reducing anal intercourse to a solely queer sexual act, exit only, summons queerphobia to pathologize anal sex as an improper and unnatural act. In this talk, I want to examine how the dual taboos of queerness and sexual intercourse, particularly in K-12 schools, place queer youth in precarious positions as they attempt to explore and establish their sexual senses of self. Drawing upon findings from multiple projects I've pursued over the past decade, I hope to also illuminate possible strategies for disrupting queerphobic sexphobia in ways that afford and advance the sexual agency of queer youth. While much of my work focuses specifically on Black queer youth's educational experiences, I will attempt to surface implications for work with non-Black identified queer and trans youth as well. Before I begin, I want to give everyone a heads up that this presentation does contain sexually explicit content. This includes frank descriptions of gay oral and anal sex. Ultimately, you will need to decide if you are comfortable listening to and watching these references. My hope, however, is that for those of you who may be uncomfortable with frank references to queer sex, this presentation can be an opportunity to push yourselves beyond your comfort zones so that you can be fully present and non-judgmental when working with queer youth. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to begin by revisiting a visit to a gay-straight alliance. That's sort of the seed for this work. I'll then talk a bit about how I frame Black queer sexual agency. I'll share some insights from my work and then end with some questions and implications. So my attention to queer youth sexual agency stems from a chance encounter I had a decade ago during a visit to a gay-straight alliance. One of my doctoral students at the time, who was also a chemistry teacher in a local high school, invited me to speak to his school's gay-straight alliance. He was the faculty advisor, and he was inviting queer identified adults to visit the GSA to talk about our work, talk about our lives, hopefully, kind of help spark, new leadership in the group. After I finished chatting with the GSA during this visit, and we opened it up for Q&A, there was a young African-American woman, I think she was maybe in 10th grade, maybe 9th, I can't remember. And she said, I have a question. This might be a dumb question, but I should ask it. But people probably think it's dumb, but I really should ask it. She kept doing this. I said, sweetie, what's the question? Just ask me. And so she asked, if a girl does it with another girl, she can't catch nothing, right? In this, I was sort of caught off guard in this moment. I looked to the teacher who had invited me to speak at the GSA, and he conveniently had his back turned to me on the other side of the room. He was setting up lab and acting like he didn't hear any of this. So I was on my own. So I said, well, actually, that's not right. And I went into an impromptu lesbian safer sex 101 talk, a talk that I had not prepared for, but it just seemed like, this was a moment that I needed to speak to, so I did my best. When I left that day, I just couldn't get that moment out of my head. On the one hand, I was really impressed by this young woman's courage, and also sort of how she calculated the way that a lot of marginalized youth have to. She kind of figured out that I was an adult that she could probably trust to, give her information, right? So she seized the opportunity to get information she needed, and sort of overcame her fear of the sort of riskiness of the moment. But on the other hand, I was also struck and dismayed by the constraints of that moment. This was a moment that was beyond the official curriculum for the school. So any student who was not in the GSA that day wouldn't have access to that information. It was also a singular and incomplete moment. Anyone who in public health who does safer sex work will tell you that you need more than one opportunity to deliver these types of messages and help people sort of, kind of feel their way through them. And it was also a risky moment. The teacher who invited me actually had tenure, but he, was intentional about not getting involved in that moment, because if, a parent called the principal and said, hey, I heard your club is teaching kids how to have lesbian sex, I'm sure that his job security still would have, been in jeopardy despite having tenure. And so as a researcher, this moment made me eager to find more intentional ways for young people like this young woman in the GSA to acquire information that would support their sexual agency as Black queer youth. If it seems odd that I would suggest that K-12 schools become spaces where queer youth can get information and support for negotiating their sexualities, I'd like you to consider how K-12 schools routinely allow for spaces where heterosexual youth's sexualities are reflected and even celebrated. The absence of queer inclusive sexual health education is not a given. Rather, as with all matters related to American education, it is the product of contentious power struggles that have more often than not made American public schooling a site of inequity, exclusion, and injustice. My particular interest is to trouble how anti-queerness in American schooling denies youth access to information about their sexualities. This denied access has several layers. One layer is the lack of access to comprehensive sexual health education in American K-12 schools. As these data compiled by the Gushmeiser Institute illustrate, I think I mispronounced that, my apologies. Sexual health education, a logical site within K-12 schools to address queer sexual resilience and agency, is characterized by a number of constraints. Among them, the lack of mandates for sex education across all states, parental opt-out policies, the persistence of abstinence-focused programs, and the lack of mandates for including sexual orientation in sex education. For queer youth, the lack of access to comprehensive sex education in schools is compounded in several southern states by no promo homo laws, as illustrated in light blue on this map from GLSEN. These laws prohibit teachers from discussing LGBTQ issues in a positive light, if at all, and can result in a teacher's termination. Barriers to comprehensive sex education in general, and to queer inclusive sex education in particular, have not completely prevented American K-12 schools from addressing the needs of queer youth. However, the register for doing so warrants troubling. Since 2009, when a rash of queer youth suicides generated unprecedented attention in American popular culture to the plight of queer kids, anti-homophobic bullying campaigns, like the ones depicted on this slide, have carved out a stable discursive space for acknowledging the presence of queer students in schools. As I and several other queer studies scholars have addressed in our scholarship, it is certainly important to interrupt homophobic bullying in schools, but it is also troubling that queer victimhood has arguably become the most pervasive trope for recognizing queer bodies in schools. Educational systems with long-standing investments in homophobia can issue pleas to stop beating up queer kids while still denying those queer kids curricular content and diverse social and emotional supports that fully address their needs as queer youth. These desexualized educational discourses on queer victims of homophobic bullying have persisted as the stakes surrounding Black queer youth sex lives have risen. For the past decade, researchers, practitioners, and activists in public health have noted the alarming shift of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the US to young Black men who have sex with men. It is important. In February 2016, researchers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported, quote, if current HIV diagnosis rates persist, about 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men and 1 in 4 Latino MSM in the United States will be diagnosed with HIV during their lifetime. It is important to note that these rising HIV infection rates among young Black MSM are driven by structural determinants of health, like poverty, lack of consistent access to culturally competent health care, lack of stable housing, and lack of culturally competent health education. Furthermore, rising HIV infection rates are coupled with rising rates of syphilis, and for the most marginalized Black queer youth, engagements in survival sex. Set against this larger backdrop, we can understand the lack of access to queer inclusive sex education as a social justice issue, one that intersects with other injustices and inequities to produce and intensify the marginalization of Black and other queer identified youth. And by framing this as a social justice issue, I'm deliberately inviting other social justice educators to consider how to participate as allies in this critical work. Next, I'd like to offer a framework for the type of work I'm pursuing before moving into specific examples of that work. So I'd like to talk a bit about how I frame Black queer sexual agency. My efforts to address this through my scholarship are grounded in my engagement with queer of color critique. A fuller description of how I use queer of color critique to frame my work can be found in this 2015 article from the journal Educational Studies. For now, though, I'll give you the 10-cent version for those who haven't read this article. Well, maybe the 25-cent version. An ongoing strategy of lesbian and gay politics in the US since the mid-20th century has been gay respectability, the representation of lesbians and gays as proper citizens capable of assimilating into heterosexual and often white, middle-class, patriarchal, and cisgender American society, as symbolized by the image on the left. This assimilationist strategy has relied on a desexualization of gay identity in the public sphere that has helped to reproduce the inaccessibility of accurate and culturally responsive information on gay sex. My work draws upon notions of queerness that emerged in the late 80s and early 90s as AIDS activists contending with the life or death stakes of homophobia and the AIDS epidemic, reclaimed queer as a term to mark identities, communities, and activism that eschewed gay respectability for militancy and disruption. A central part of that queer project was a reclamation of queer sexuality, as represented in the poster on the right from the activist organization Queer Nation, that stressed the importance of sex-positive understandings and expressions of queer sex for self-determination and joy in queer people's lives. Of course, the reclamation of queer sex has not been a simple endeavor. A crucial backdrop for my work has been the ways in which race and white supremacy have complicated queer sexual politics. The two images on this slide offer quick snapshots of how race and white supremacy have complicated the reclamation of queer sexual agency in ways that are relevant to my work. On the left is a screenshot of a white male user's profile from the popular gay male hookup app Grindr, with blackouts over his profile name and face. At the bottom of this profile, the user's tagline states, "I'm blocking more Asians on here than the Great Wall of China." And note, it should be than with an A, not then with an E. I think there seems to be a correlation between bigotry and bad grammar and misspellings, which I like to point out. This profile speaks to a growing body of scholarship exploring how white supremacy mediates desire and desirability on gay male hookup apps like Grindr. On the right is an HIV awareness ad from the mid-2000s in response to rising infection rates among Black gay men. This ad was eventually pulled after Black gay activists and advocacy groups publicly critiqued it for likening HIV infection to a gunshot, thus situating HIV transmission and Black gay male sexuality within narratives of violence, fear, stigma, and criminality. Both images illustrate how white supremacist and anti-Black discourses on queer desire and Black queer sexuality can undermine the reclamation of queer sexual agency for non-white subjects. All of this speaks to why I draw upon a body of scholarship called Queer of Color Critique, which gets its name from Roderick Ferguson's fabulous 2004 text, Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique. As I discuss in much more detail in my educational studies article, a Queer of Color Critique indexes an interdisciplinary corpus of scholarship on the dialectics between hegemony and resistance that shape the lives of queer people of color. A major concern within this body of work is a queer of color sexual agency. Books like the ones pictured on this slide chronicle the complicated, risky, sexy, and agentive negotiations of sexual identities and practices by queers of color in their everyday lives. In all cases, these negotiations unfold in socio-political contexts where sex and queerness intersect with race, class, religion, nationality, and other markers of difference, and where queer people of color create and share sexual knowledges that enable them to explore pleasure and other sexual possibilities. All of this leads to how I conceptualize Black queer sexual agency. While I draw upon work from queer of color critique, I focus specifically on Black queer sexual agency here, since my work thus far has centered on the lives of Black queer subjects. In a nutshell, I define Black queer sexual agency as Black queer subjects' everyday negotiations of sexual identities, desires, practices, and networks, with a particular attention to strategies and contexts that enable Black queer sexual self-determination and fulfillment. These forms of agency are exercised within and against anti-Black, anti-queer, and anti-sex structures, policies, and discourses. I pointed to some examples in earlier slides, such as educational policies that police knowledge production on queer sex, and the structural determinants of health that make Black queer youth disproportionately vulnerable to HIV and AIDS and survival sex. These barriers also include Black familial or religious contexts that demonize queer sex, and racist sexual politics in queer clubs or on queer hookup apps that mark Black queer bodies as undesirable. And these forms of agency are mediated by multiple identities, experiences, agendas, and pleasures, thus precluding any single grand narrative of Black queer sexual freedom. Given the diversity that exists under the categorical umbrella of Black queerness, Black queer sexual agency must be understood in its diverse manifestations. Situated within educational studies, I come to my work with the following overarching question. How can we create pedagogical contexts and opportunities for nurturing Black queer youth's sexual agency? Since I draw upon work that I've done with Black queer youth, I frame this question again around their experiences specifically. However, I will discuss at the end of my talk how my work might have some implications for the sexual agency of other queer youth as well. In the time that remains, I would like to share some snippets of my work on Black queer sexual agency, drawing upon two projects, the MAC study and the SENT study, which I'll describe in a bit. And I have a little piece on using TV and film that I'm working on for the book, but we may have to skip that for now if time prohibits that. And if so, just make sure you get the book when it comes out. It'll be in there. First, I'd like to share some insights from a project I did on a site that I call the Midtown AIDS Center. And just, I want to remind people again that I'm going to have some sexually explicit content in this presentation. My first attempt to empirically study the experiences of Black queer youth took place about a year after the GSA visit that I described at the beginning of the talk. I have written about this study in 4 publications so far, one of them being this 2016 article from Urban Education. Across most of these pieces, I've used culturally responsive pedagogy as a lens to translate the significance of work in out-of-school spaces to school-based stakeholders. While it was not my intent of this study to focus on sexual agency. That was a theme, one of the themes that emerged as really significant. So what I did was I spent several months at the Midtown AIDS Center, which was a HIV/AIDS prevention and services center in a city in the northeast section of the United States. And the center worked primarily with Black and Latino urban queer youth. I volunteered there first and just noticed how the space was kind of operating as an alternative educational space for those young people, many of whom had been pushed out of their local schools. And so I wanted to study it more intentionally to figure out what might schools learn from the work that was happening at MAC. This is a quick summary of my methods, which, if you want to see these more in depth, learn about my methods more in depth, definitely check out my urban education article. But just for time, I'm gonna move forward. The time I conducted this study at MAC at a time when the CDC released an earlier report on a 50% increase in HIV infections among young Black gay men nationwide. That in Midtown, that increase was around 90%. And a big reason for that was because Midtown has really high poverty rates. And so the structural determinants of health that put certain populations more at risk were really alive and well, unfortunately, at Midtown. But again, I did this study at Midtown, and I was really struck by the ways in which the staff was very intentional about nurturing the sexual agency of the young people who attended their programming, and how eager those young people were to get that programming. This events calendar from several years ago captures some of MAC's sexual health educational efforts in their weekly Thursday sexual health workshops. I'd like you all to focus in particular on this Thursday column. So we have You've Got a Mouth, Use It, which was a program on oral sex and included strategies for how to apply a condom with your mouth. Because if you can apply a condom using your mouth, it's a way to eroticize condom usage, particularly if you're engaging with a partner who's resistant to using a condom. So it's a really important skill, sort of safer sex skill. Ride 'em Cowboy was a session on anal sex that was led by a transgender former sex worker. From Head to Toe was on the use of fetish toys. Touch Me Here, Touch Me There was a session on erotic massage, and it included a screening of a tantric massage video, as well as an activity using dental dams where they would put a dental dam on their hand and then lick the dental dam. And the facilitator was like, you can feel that, right? Okay, so a dental dam doesn't necessarily lessen the sensitivity that you experience during sexual encounters. The erotic massage video was also a safer sex strategy, because I remember the young people kept talking about the bump test. So erotic massage is not only a strategy for foreplay, but it also gives you an opportunity to investigate your partner's body to see if there are any bumps or any smells that might give you pause. And so it's a way to, sort of investigate who you're with and see is there anything that might give me pause for actually going any further, right? So these were really tangible skills for young people to negotiate safer sex encounters while also attending to pleasure in sexuality, right? So it wasn't just protect yourself, be safe, there's stuff out there, but how do you engage in sexual practices in ways that are both safe but also enjoyable, pleasurable? These were complemented by the workshops on Wednesday, which focused on relationships. Throughout MAC, there were also other artifacts that spoke to a sort of culturally responsive approach to sexual health education. I love my Boo campaign by Gay Men's Health Crisis, situated safer sex messaging in culturally authentic imagery of young Black, gay, and Latino male relationships. I guess now would be I love my bae. So Boo, I guess is a little outdated, but the idea here is to show not just focus on sex, but also on healthy relationships and healthy relationships with people who look like the young people who were in at MAC, right? And so if you look down here at the tagline, we're about trust, respect, and commitment. Safer sex is one way we show our love. Peggy Lee was the pseudonym of one of the staff members at MAC who led a lot of these workshops. And she had this to say when I asked her to reflect on it. All of these things are important, especially the fetishism and the massage, even oral sex and anal sex. We talk about foreplay a lot because foreplay, you get to inspect your partner, you know? And if you don't know your partner's body, you don't know what you're sleeping with. Also, it gives them ideas of what they can do until they find out another person's HIV status. And they know it for sure. And they know what their own status is. So if I can have fun in all these different ways, and I know how to give head good with a condom or without, but I can do it with the condom and I feel confident in that, then we've given them an outlet. M was the pseudonym of one of the young people who attended MAC's programming. And he had this to say about the sexual health programming. I wish that the things that we learn here at MAC, we would learn in our health class, because a lot of stuff that I've learned here, I didn't learn in school. And it's helped me out. It's helped me stay safe as far as I am. I get tested every 3 months for HIV, not because I have sex that often, which I don't, which is kind of sad. No, I'm just kidding. But a lot of people at school don't know to get tested every 3 months. This was a common sentiment expressed by young people, that they were getting stuff at MAC that they weren't getting in their schools. And it was really important for them to have access to information about how to engage in sex in ways that was queer inclusive, sex positive, and also safer sex oriented. I should note, however, that not everything was perfect at MAC. My fabulous colleague, Tomas Boatwright, he helped me write this chapter on the experiences of some of the trans youth at MAC. When we began the study, Tomas and I facilitated a workshop during which we posted large sheets of paper around the room. Each paper had a different identity written at the top of it: lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer. We asked young people to go around to each sheet and to write what came to mind when they saw each of those identities, because we wanted to make sure we understood those identities in ways that were resonant with the young people. During that activity, on the list for transgender, we started to see some of the cisgender gay males in the room ended up writing transphobic, sexphobic, pejorative terms about some of the trans youth in the room who were engaged in survival sex. So Craigslist whores and Backpage, those were references to websites where a few of the young trans women who were in the room advertised their availability for sex work. Prostitutes giving head in the alley. These were all sort of terms meant to disparage those trans youth. And so we got caught off guard by it, and a big fight broke out, and the staff had to come in to help us break it up. And it was a real eye-opening experience for us because it sort of underscored for us that in a space that appeared to be a safer space for Black and Latino queer youth, there were still some, this space wasn't actually safe for all, right? And so we actually talk in this chapter that I showed you about the transphobic discourses in the space and how it made it difficult for trans youth to navigate MAC at times. So just to tie this together, I think some takeaways from the work at MAC is that we get to see what a queer, inclusive, sex positive approach to sexual health education with Black queer youth might look like. And we see how that also might become more culturally responsive with contributions from community experts, right? Like, I mean, think about how difficult it could be in K-12 schools to get approval to bring in a trans former sex worker to talk about anal sex. But that happened at MAC because MAC was connected to the community and recognized that community members had a lot of expertise to give to young people. And there was a focus on specific skills and information, right? How to apply a condom using your mouth, how to use erotic massage as a way to explore your partner's body to see if there are any bumps that might give you pause for moving forward. This focus on specific skills was something that young people really appreciated. But there were challenges. A lot of the work at MAC was cisgender male focused because their funding came from HIV funding streams that were targeted towards Black and Latino cisgender queer identified males. And there was this challenge presented by transphobic discourses on trans sex work. There's also limited accessibility, right? Like this was something that was only accessible to young people who were able to make it to MAC, who were able to sort of navigate how to both sort of like get literal access in terms of transportation, but also were able to figure out how to do that in ways that didn't put them in trouble with parents, guardians, et cetera, right? So those are some of the challenges that emerge from this. Let's see, okay, let me speed up here. So let me just give you a few quick insights from my work from the SENT study, and then I'll shut up so that LJ can pose some final questions. So the SENT study, following my MAC study, I connected with a fabulous colleague, Dr. Mitchell Wharton at the University of Rochester, who was working with that same population. Both of us noted at the time that the rising use of hookup apps amongst the young people that we were working with at MAC for sort of not only engaging in sexual connections, but also sort of learning about sex. And so we wanted to get a better sense of how young people that we were working with were drawing upon networked technologies, smartphones, apps, hookup apps, et cetera, to learn about sex. So we got a grant from the Center for AIDS Research to do what we called the SENT study. SENT stood for Sexual Engagements with Network Technologies. What we basically did was we had 22 participants in all young Black gay males. We basically sat down with each of them, gave them an iPad and said, show us the porn sites that you go to and how you navigate them. Show us the hookup apps that you use and how you navigate those and what stands out to you, how you gather information from these. Excuse me. I should note that there's been a growing recognition that young people are using online porn increasingly as a site for sexual health education. My work considers intersections of race, gender, and sexuality that to date haven't always emerged in some of these popular media takes on young people's use of online porn. So let me just do two themes real quick and then I'll try to close up. So a common theme across the participants in the SENT study was how porn operated as a site of sexual education. In the absence of comprehensive queer inclusive sex ed in their formal schooling experiences, participants described learning about queer sex from online porn sites. For instance, one participant named Bobby spoke to this theme in the following interview excerpt. The positions that you have to do when you are, you have to be sexually versed. So you got to learn certain positions. And being a bottom, there are certain things you have to learn how to do. Learn how to suck dick properly. Learn how to ride. Certain positions you have to maintain. So those are some of the things I've learned. Watching online porn, made me confident being a bottom. Bottom is a receptive partner in an anal insertive encounter. To be honest with you, because like I get to learn more positions, learn what is expected of me. I lacked confidence starting out as a bottom. This was a recurring theme, that being able to see sex actually depicted in videos allowed these young people to actually learn some of the skills they needed to engage in sexual encounters, queer sexual encounters. I'm going to skip up here to talk about one of the challenges, though. In attempting to understand study participants' experiences with network technologies, another major takeaway became quickly evident. The porn sites and hookup apps that they visited tended to reproduce limited notions of Black queer male sexual subjectivities. An example of this can be seen in the screenshot from a video titled Black Thugs from the free porn site Pornhub. So I'm going to show you a screenshot. This is a screenshot of a video that one of the young people that was in the study said, this is the type of video that he would go watch when he went to Pornhub. It's a sexually explicit shot, so I just want to give you a heads up, but I think it'll be really illuminating to the issue that I want to underscore here, that on the one hand, porn really helped these young people learn about queer sexual practices, but on the other hand, it reproduced some really problematic constructions of Black masculinity. So in this video, there's a threesome going on here with one guy in the center. He's being penetrated from behind by one and engaging in oral sex with another partner in the front. And the dialogue is all really hyper aggressive, like, yeah, nigga, take this, put that shit in your mouth. It's this whole performance of hyper masculinity. And this is a video that one of the young people says, yeah, this is the type of video I watch. The three characteristics recurred across videos like this. One, dominant partners or tops performed a hyper masculinity punctuated by nigga talk and sexual aggression. Two, submissive partners were reduced to sexual objects, often objectified by more than one man at a time. And three, intimacy and connectedness were often minimalized or completely excluded. If I had more time, I'd go further into that last piece, because that's another big takeaway from the SENT project, was the sort of struggle in these digital platforms to actually find intimacy, both sort of in the porn artifacts that the young men were looking at to sort of learn about sex, as well as in the connections they made through smartphone hookup apps, right? That the focus of the apps is often on hookups, and a lot of these young men were just beginning their encounters with others, and were also looking for intimacy that these realms didn't always provide. So I'm going to skip ahead to my closing, since I'm almost out of time. I'm sorry, I'm just a long-winded academic, but let me close up here with a few parting questions and suggestions. And then people should feel free to email me to hear about some of the stuff that I'm glossing over or that I'm skipping. But I want to just close with some questions for future research that I think are important for folks to consider if you're interested in taking up this work. These include, what factors inform sexual agency for a broader range of Black queer subjects? Because my work has focused primarily on cisgender gay males. How can multiple disciplinary and research orientations shape future work on Black queer youth sexual agency? I'm coming from this as an educational scholar, so what do anthropologists and economists and other folks have to contribute to how we think about this? In what spaces can this work occur, and what affordances and constraints are associated with these spaces? This is really important, because those of us who are doing work like this, I'm thinking of colleagues like Lance McCready, Cindy Cruz, Molly Blackbird, and some others. Most of us have done this work in out-of-school spaces. And on the one hand, those out-of-school spaces afford a little more freedom for youth workers to actually go there in terms of the topics. But it also means then a constraint of just not having access to lots of young people. Where can we secure institutional and financial support for this work? And how is this work relevant for youth who are not Black and or queer identified? For teacher educators, I want to stress a couple of implications of this work. I think implications include expanding professional development on LGBTQ issues to include information on sex and sexual agency. So often, I do a lot of PDs around LGBTQ issues for teachers, and so often the expectation is to just sort of focus on anti-bullying and maybe some curriculum development, but to not go into sex. And that's actually, I think, preventing teachers from being assets for young people. And other implications include engaging queer of color critique, queer culturally responsive pedagogy, and sex positivity as frameworks in teacher education, creating partnerships with community-based organizations and public health agencies to lead professional developments, deliver in-school curriculum, and or provide out-of-school resources. These organizations can really, I think, make up for the slack that often exists in K-12 schools. Identifying in-school resources and opportunities for work on queer youth sexual agency, in particular targeting like nurses, in-school health clinics, and counselors, since often those folks are able to work more privately with young people around sex and sexuality issues, and advocating for district and state level policies in support of comprehensive sex education. Last slide, some implications for K-12 practitioners. Learn about queer sex and relationships so that you're familiar enough with it so that if young people raise these topics, you have some familiarity and you're not communicating a discomfort that will then make young people uncomfortable and silent. Learn about the social determinants of queer sexual identities, behaviors, and experiences so that you have a nuanced understanding of what queer youth are actually negotiating. Practice talking about queer sex and relationships on queer and sex positive terms. And lastly, and I really want to underscore this, identify school and community-based resources and supports that address queer youth sexual agency. Many teachers will continue to find themselves in schools where it'll be difficult to actually broach topics around queer sex. But if you at least know what some of the school and community-based resources are, community-based organizations, health educators in local hospitals, then you can direct students to those resources as a way for support. Hopefully that made sense. I really apologize for rushing at the end. I'm a terribly long-winded academic, but hopefully that made some sense, and look forward to talking with LJ.
Hello, Dr. Brockenbrough. Nice to you. It's always a pleasure to engage with your work, and it's even better when we get to hear it from you firsthand. So thank you. Sure, I speak on behalf of everyone. Thank you so much. It was a lovely talk, and just, yeah, I really enjoyed getting to hear about the different types of learning spaces and what they make possible and impossible in their own ways. So yeah, you've left me with a lot to think about, which I appreciate, especially at the start of a new term. So see if I can get a couple of questions in here, but we'll see what we can do. So I'd like to start with, okay, so youth are already teaching themselves about sexual health, right? And you showed that marvelously through your work on sexual agency. And they're doing this in and outside of schools. So I guess I'm wondering, what do school-based sexual health programs still have to offer queer and trans youth? And what might it mean for the future of sex education for queer and trans youth to divest from these school-based programs?
One of the themes that I skipped over because I didn't manage my time well enough was that in the SENT study, one of the, a really important theme was that the young men in that study encountered challenges that they had to negotiate either on their own or with assistance from peers who were either the same age or maybe 1 or 2 years older than they were. And so one thing they were struggling with was, how to make sense of encounters that they didn't have someone with a little more experience, a little more perspective to help them negotiate some really complicated, sexual decision making. That was a recurrent theme throughout, and actually, my colleague Mitchell and I, in our interviews, our interviews also were not just sort of research spaces, but they also ended up being therapeutic spaces, as some of the participants disclosed really emotional experiences that they hadn't disclosed with others. And so it was like we were actually doing some of that work in the interview. So while, yes, young people are learning stuff on their own and teaching each other how to negotiate their sexual lives, there's still room for adults who are have a broader knowledge base than young people to help them navigate those trajectories. And that's actually something that we saw at MAC, right? That these were at MAC, you had adults who were doing that work and who were creating the space for young people to ask questions and then go out and teach one another. The second part of your question, LJ, was, what was the second part of it?
It's what it might mean for the future of school-based sex education programs if queer and trans youth are divesting from these.
So, in the short term, those of us who are really committed to comprehensive sex ed, which includes, queer inclusive, trans inclusive, sex positive approaches to sexual health education, definitely need to continue to support out of school spaces that have been committed to that work for quite long periods of time. We will continue to have strong resistance to formally including those perspectives into K-12 schools, for sure. So one implication, I think, is to make sure that we continue to support the out-of-school spaces that have been doing the work. Another implication, though, is to figure out some strategic ways to bring that queer and trans inclusive work into schools, since not all young people have access to peers or adults who can help them wrestle with some of the dilemmas that they're facing, some of the questions that are emerging for them. One of the things that I have not written about yet, because I don't want to out people, is how some of the teachers I worked with in a city that I won't name, to again protect them, would bring community-based educators, sexual health educators from local nonprofits, or folks from some hospitals will have community health educators as well, right? That teachers would bring those folks kind of on the low into their class to lead sessions where they were giving, where they were just doing comprehensive sex ed, which included addressing, frankly and honestly addressing questions that emerge from queer and trans youth. So I think since not all youth will have access to those out of school spaces, or they won't have access to sounding boards to help them wrestle with that information, we still need to figure out strategic ways to get that information into schools in ways that don't raise red flags and bring out the cavalry to try to,
Mhm.
you know, hang us. Mixing metaphors there, but hopefully you got that.
I did. Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to follow up on that quickly, if possible. I know we're past time. Am I okay to ask another question? Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry, I went over. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I don't care. I'm not in charge here. Who's driving the bus? So in thinking about what you were just saying, it was reminding me of that moment you're talking about at the GSA. And I think that a lot of sex education that happens, I mean, in part happens outside of schools, but when it happens in schools, it happens, you know, from people who come into schools in these sort of like outside inside moments, you know, where it's like not part of the regular day. It feels like an alternative exception to the norm. There's someone who comes in who's not usually there. They're talking about something that's not part of your everyday like routine discussion, right? And it feels like a break, right, in the day. And you talked about this moment in the GSA, you know, and said that it was a risky moment. And this idea of risk, right, which you write about a lot, and this tethering of risk to queer youth, to Black queer youth, and the relationship of that to then getting like prescribed victimhood. But thinking about this, sex education has this long history, right, with preoccupation of risk and everything. And so when we're trying to think about how to have these like, queer and trans inclusive, you know, the types of conversations that could be happening at MAC, right? How do we have them inside a school when it doesn't feel like a risky moment? Because the conversations at MAC were not risky moments, right? Risk wasn't enveloping that discussion. So how do you have those types of conversations in schools? And I guess what I'm wondering, now I'm long-winded, is what is the role then of rethinking risk as educators, school-based educators, in trying to create culturally responsive supports and education programs for queer and trans youth?
A few things come to mind. I'll try to do this quickly so that, since I know we're out of time. I have a fabulous doctoral student here at Penn named Monique Perry, who's getting ready to propose her dissertation. She's looking at the ways in which, or she's planning on looking at the ways in which teachers engage in sexuality education, even when they don't think they are. Because there are actually moments in the everyday life of teaching, in the everyday life of schooling, when sex and sexuality and sexual orientation come up. And so I think one of the ways to kind of take the sting out of these sort of high profile, risky moments of sex ed, and particularly sex ed for queer and trans youth, is to figure out, you know, what texts in an English class enable, you know, afford conversations around sex and sexuality in a way that's just part of the analysis of the text, right? And not a special earmarked day on queerness. Or in history, you know, when I was a high school history teacher, I used to do a lesson on Michael Wigglesworth, who was a Puritan preacher who wrote in a private journal about his shame around his queerness. And, you know, I brought that up in, I think when I was doing Salem, and, you know, just like the Puritans' persecution of difference, right? And so, but we got into like sort of these interesting conversations about what actually counts as queerness, given that queerness is kind of a more contemporary construct. How does it apply to what we're reading here, right? But that there are ways that we can actually, and there are people who are doing this work, integrate these conversations into subjects that at least afford moments to, that actually kind of create opportunities to talk about sex and sexuality in ways that aren't earmarked as a special day. How explicit those conversations can get, though, into the mechanics of sex is still a challenge, but it does at least allow, I mean, because I can remember this from when I was teaching, those moments identified me as a teacher that young people could come to as a resource for follow-up questions, right? And further reading, so to speak. So I think that's one way to do it, is to help all teachers figure out how to make space for sex-connected conversations in their classrooms. I think another is to make it also just sort of like a regular part of the work that school nurses and in school health clinics, for schools that have those resources, part of the regular work that they do, right? So, and counselors, right? So nurses who just, who have different types of condoms, right? Just in their offices, right? And who have pamphlets on where to get information around STD testing, or counselors who have just information in their office on name change policies, right? Gender identification changes, like making it just part of the everyday sort of scenery, I think is another way to edge toward what you're talking about, LJ, even though it doesn't fully get there.
Thank you. Dr. Keenan.
All right, many thanks to you, Dr. Brockenbrough, for your presentation this evening. I know that I have learned a lot and you've given me a lot to think about. So thank you so much. Thanks to the audience for showing up tonight. I know that it's challenging in the evening to do that. And thanks to LJ for these really rich questions. So with that, we'll say goodnight, and thanks again, Dr. Brockenbrough.
Thank you, and again, my apologies for being long-winded.